President Trump vows to end the war between Russia and Ukraine. He's sending a big delegation to make headway in Munich. I've got the American conservatives Curt Mills and our own Stella Escobedo here to tell us what to expect from those negotiations. Plus, is the Department of Defense funding a foreign influence operation? And is Mark Zuckerberg funding the lawsuits against Elon Musk's Doge? The War Room's Natalie Winters is here with Breitbart's Wendell Hughesbrough. They'll break it all down in moments. Plus, moms are taking over classrooms and illegals are taking over voting. I'm covering it all next on the Matt Gaetz Show. Let's do this. We're shaking up Washington, D.C. We're breaking the fever.
You ever watch this guy on television? It's like a machine. He's great. Matt Gaetz.
In addition to President Trump having to rescue the economy, secure the border, deport illegals, combat the bird flu, and cut wasteful spending, he's also had to wind down the Biden wars in a way that doesn't harm America long term. The longest war seems to be raging in the Middle East, and the ceasefire there continues a most fragile hold. There is another war raging between Russia and Ukraine. President Trump has been the only recent president not to have Russia invading their neighbors. Russia took Crimea during Obama's tenure. They invaded Georgia and Chechnya before that, and of course, tried to take Kyiv during Biden's presidency. President Trump seeks to end this war to stop all the death.
It's a vicious war, probably 1.5 million soldiers killed in a short period of time. I've never seen anything. I have pictures that are, you wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't believe what you have to look at. Young, beautiful soldiers that are just being decimated. And it would be nice to end it immediately.
We've known Trump's motivation. Now we may be getting a better glimpse into his plan. The American team is expected to include Secretary of State Marco Rubio, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Middle East Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. These discussions are planned to take place in Munich, Germany. President Trump is set to meet with President Putin in Saudi Arabia.
We're going to meet also probably in Saudi Arabia. The first time we'll meet in Saudi Arabia, see if we can get something done. We both understand, we know the Crown Prince, and I think it'd be a very good place to meet.
This diplomatic initiative follows a successful prisoner exchange between the United States and Russia, signaling a potential thaw in relations that could facilitate a peace process. Recent efforts have showcased President Trump's proactive approach to international diplomacy. His direct communications with Putin and Zelensky may have set the stage for potential peace. Yesterday, President Trump announced that he and President Putin had agreed to initiate immediate talks. In subsequent conversations, President Zelensky confirmed that he had a meaningful conversation with President Trump expressing Ukraine's strong desire for peace. For years, we've been told that this war is an existential struggle, a grand moral battle where Ukraine is courageously the David standing up against Russia, the evil Goliath. And yet for all the righteous posturing, all the teary speeches about defending democracy, there's one thing Ukraine never seemed particularly interested in: ending the war. Ukraine should be incentivized to conclude this conflict. Since 2022, Western taxpayers, whether they've liked it or not, have bankrolled Ukraine to the tune of over $200 billion, making it the most expensive conflict the United States has supported since the last two forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what did Ukraine get in return? A destroyed economy, depopulated cities, and a government so dependent on foreign aid that it makes a junkie look self-sufficient. The country's GDP collapsed over 30% in the first year alone. Millions of people fled, and large chunks of the industrial base now belong to Russia. Infrastructure bombed to oblivion. Energy grid hanging on by a thread. Manpower, they're literally drafting men off the streets at this point, sometimes without their consent. Russia should also want to end this war. While Putin is still standing, his country is paying for the war in rubles, resources, and the lives of young men. The Kremlin has poured an estimated $150 billion into the war effort, and while that sounds like chump change compared to the Western money pit, Russia has taken a serious economic hit. Sanctions forced them to reinvent their economy on the fly, and while they've managed to keep things running, the cost of war is starting to bite. There's a massive human cost. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have been wounded or killed. The country's labor force is shrinking as young men either die in combat or flee conscription. While Moscow's propaganda machine spins as if this is some sort of patriotic struggle, the reality is that an entire generation of Russians is being sacrificed for the Kremlin's ambitions. So who's winning? Nobody. Ukraine is a smoldering ruin. Russia is bleeding money and men, and the West is tired of paying for all of it with no clear endgame. The only real winners? Defense contractors and arms dealers. Funny how that always happens. Joining us now is an executive director for the American Conservative magazine, Curt Mills, and One American News anchor, Stella Escobedo, who knows a great deal about this area of the world as well. Curt, I want to start with you. President Trump has assembled this team to go to Munich. What do you think their message will be?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot has changed in a week. You have a clear message from the White House that they want this war over yesterday. This was not at all the tone in Washington in late January. There was a lot of concern that, you heard Special Envoy Keith Kellogg say this might take 100 days. It looks like the White House is driving a hard bargain fast. What Secretary Hegseth said over the week, sort of, front-running the vice president's meeting with Zelensky that's going to happen tomorrow, saying that NATO membership for Ukraine is off the table and they want a deal now, can't be emphasized enough. This war might be coming to a close, hopefully.
Stella, I know you cover this very, very closely for One American News. What do you think Russia and Ukraine are each going to be negotiating for in practicality as these discussions begin in earnest?
Well, first of all, I have to say, this war did not have to happen, and President Trump keeps talking about it. He keeps saying this could have been avoided. So many people dead, so many young people dead. Ultimately, the answer will be, we kind of heard it, no NATO. They're not going to join NATO, and no pre-2014 borders. It's just not going to happen. But I have to say something. Kudos to President Trump. What we are seeing right now, we are seeing new alliances being built. We are seeing President Trump, this kind of thinking did not exist, Matt, in our last administration. We have a president who doesn't want this war to continue. We have a president who actually is completely different than the last administration, because in the last administration, President Biden did not even speak to Putin for 3.5 years. We have a president who is putting America first, and he's bringing Americans home.
Curt, when this finally resolves, what do you think the situation looks like there? Just an agreement from Ukraine not to join NATO and the EU, and then maybe the Donbas region as some sort of buffer with Crimea still in Russia's hands? Or is there any major piece of territory whose fate we don't know going into this?
The tragic thing about it is that this looks very similar to the Minsk II agreements and also the deal that was on the table in spring of 2022 before apparently then Prime Minister Boris Johnson scuttled the whole thing. It's basically freezing the battle lines. Crimea, the peninsula out there with Odessa, it looks even more frozen in Russian control, and not much changes. It's an open question heading into the 2030s. What the government in Ukraine looks like, but for now, it looks like a freeze on battle lines if the Russians assent to it. I think that's the major wild card here. It's not as if the U.S. looks like it's going to pull out at this point. It's not as if the Ukrainians have much of a choice, frankly, if the White House plays its hand right. It looks the only wild card is whether or not Putin goes for more, and I think that's why you see the sort of level of vigor and impetus you get from the new administration to get this done, because I think they know that's a real risk.
And staying with you for a second, Curt, when you say Putin could potentially go for more, what would that more be?
Yeah, just keep the war going and hope they can grind the Ukrainians down. I think that the last thing that Trump wants to do, it's very similar to Afghanistan, actually. In 2017, this time, Trump had a choice. He could leave Afghanistan or he could escalate. The Troika generals, Mattis, Kelly, McMaster, sort of talked him into an escalation. If you remember that speech in August or September of 2017, Trump said he didn't want to be there pretty openly. And I don't think he wants to make that speech again. So if you're Putin, you could gamble that Trump does not want to do a surge in Ukraine, another spending package, and just try to take more and more territory. I think that's unlikely, but some hawks within Putin's own government want to go for that, and some foreign policy heads think it's possible.
And it does create a certain sense of urgency to get to a resolution of this. And I wonder, Stella, where Europe is in all of it, because if they're going to have to foot more of the bill, are you going to see some of these European democracies pushing Ukraine to accept terms like Curt laid out, or are they going to want to fund this in perpetuity?
I think they want it to end. With President Trump being in power, I mean, as I just mentioned earlier, we're seeing different alliances shift. Also, I want to mention, the Middle East. We have Saudi Arabia that is involved in all of this, which is really important. We have, MBS, who is good friends with President Trump. MBS is good friends with Russia, with Ukraine. They were selling oil to Russia. And I think that, this is the time for, all wars to stop. The president keeps talking about the EU, saying they've been horrible, they've been terrible. I mean, you know this, Matt. About a year ago, when Russia had sanctions put on their oil, Saudi Arabia came in, bought the oil for a cheaper price. Then the oil was sold back into the market, we think, and they still got Russian oil.
Yeah, it's curious. Trump has always postured this conflict as a consequence of energy prices, and he's believed that the price of energy ultimately can facilitate a quicker resolution. Curt, do you think that is playing into these hopefully final weeks of war, or is there a broader dynamic at play?
I think the economy is relevant. I mean, the sort of hardliners, both on the neoconservative right and within the former Biden administration, thought they were going to be able to collapse the Russian economy. The Russian economy has not had a great go of it, really, frankly, the last 10 years since the original energy shocks of 2014. But they're doing fine. I do not think the economic conditions of Russia are an existential threat to the government there. And I think that's another reason why the U.S. wants to come to the table. If Harris had been elected, I think you would have very likely seen an escalation because the Democrats, along with the remaining allies on the Wall Street Journal editorial board, et cetera, were ideologically committed to a regime change war all the way to Moscow. Trump and team obviously aren't, and I think that's the prudent path.
It is interesting that Saudi Arabia is playing this growing role. You saw the Israel-Hamas negotiations occur in Doha, and you wonder whether or not Saudi seeking to host the discussions between Putin and Trump is a little bit of keeping up with the Joneses among the Middle Eastern monarchies. Stella, do you believe that Saudi Arabia can actually play a major role here in bringing these parties together?
I really do. I really think that as Saudi Arabia does this, Trump, takes the moment to seize for Abraham Accords 2.0. I think a strong Saudi Arabia in the Middle East also kind of puts Iran to the side. And we've heard Donald Trump talking about putting the maximum pressure on Iran. Also, we can't forget China. It plays a big role in all of this as well. Again, I started by saying new alliances. Are you following this? You're seeing like the differences. You have Russia, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Trump now back at the table. And then when China comes into play, we're talking about the rare earth minerals that Trump is talking about in Ukraine. Well, why does President Trump, even want to have these conversations? Well, because China is the #1 manufacturer of, the chips, right? These semiconductor chips. If you kind of put China in this position where China no longer becomes the #1 producer, I think they'll still be big, but then you have Ukraine, you have Russia, and then, Trump talks about, the regions that actually will, that have these rare earth minerals, the Donbas region, will most likely be part of Russia.
It is a resource-rich area. Mm-hmm. I don't know that they become functionally part of Russia. I would probably bet that they end up as independent states, but highly influenced by their trading relationships and then the contracting resource relationships that they would have with the Russians. And Curt, if this concludes as we may expect, with the battle lines being frozen, I suspect that Putin will claim this as a geopolitical win, and the way that Zelensky will sell this as a win will be based on the redevelopment funds. And so who do you think is going to be forking over most of the cash to rebuild Ukraine? Is that going to be some sort of robber baron game where we take it from the Russian oligarchs, or do you think that'll be a burden on U.S. taxpayers much in the way it was in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of thing that people were talking about 18 months ago was a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, but I just think that's a dead letter within this administration. I mean, Trump himself, key allies like Steve Bannon have talked about that 1 cent should not go to Ukraine while LA is still, burnt to a crisp in Appalachia, which is obviously a key source for Trump and Vance's political constituency. It remains moribund economically. I think it's unlikely. I think it's possible the U.S. contributes to some sort of rebuild, but I think you're going to see Washington beyond Brussels, beyond Berlin, beyond Paris, beyond London to drive the bus there. And I think for Zelensky, that's obviously a cause for anxiety. But I think that's why he shouldn't have pursued such a hardline war that he didn't run himself.
It's a hot take. They're going to have to pay for their own European battle space in Europe. Curt Mills, the American Conservative Executive Director, and our own Stella Escobedo, One American News anchor. Thanks so much for joining me and discussing.